All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to make sure and put myself on speaker mode. What I would ask everybody to do is to put themselves on mute right now so that the speaker mode means that whoever is speaking is usually the person that pops up in front of you, and that's what's going to be recorded. So I invite you to do that if you can. Let me make sure and do this real quick. I need to make sure I'm the one. And there may be moments where if you are speaking, we may sort of mute you or not speak. Well, not when you're speaking, but if you're there's a lot of background noise, we may mute you. Kevin Fruchtel, my colleague in this, will be helping out as well. So welcome today to this workshop, which is called One Shepherd, Two Flocks, or sometimes even three flocks in some particular settings. And what we're talking here is about some advice and guidance on sharing a pastor. And this is going to be, I'm going to sort of share some options with you later on about ways churches can go into the future in terms of how they construct their ministry, practice their ministries in terms of pastoral leadership. But our focus today really will be on the idea of one pastor perhaps serving two or three churches at the same time. And we'll get to talk about that in a little section in a second. For those of you who are clergy and wish to have some sort of credit for this, meaning continuing education credit, would you do me a favor and just in the chat function, just say clergy wants credit, and make sure you put your name next to it so that I have your full name so that we can send you our certificate for this so that you'll get some credit if you are, well, all of us for clergy types are it's important for us to get that credit for us as we go forward. So the goal of the workshop today is I really want to talk, I'm going to do kind of three or four major things along with my colleagues. We're going to talk about some facts and figures when it comes to search and call right now. And when I say search and call, that's my area, which I do here in the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference. I'm the Associate Conference Minister for Search and Call. So I focus on the work of making sure the congregations have the pastoral leadership they need and want for the future. I've only been in the position for 18 months, and I can tell you right now, it was shocking in many ways. I just left a church after 10 years, and the difference between 10 years and now, when my former church was in search, is amazing and disturbing and challenging in many ways. So we're going to do a little bit of facts and figures here in the Pennsylvania Southeast. We've done some work with our wonderful assistant for search and call, and our registrar, Bree Rarick, did some research about the state of search and call, and I'm going to share those figures with you in a second. And those are figures that you can share with your church family as well, so that they know where the state of search and call is. And I bring this up when I begin conversations with congregations about where they are, what they're needing in terms of pastoral leadership. I'm going to talk a little bit as well about what are the options nowadays in a time of declining membership, declining finances. From a lot of our churches, I would say the vast majority of our churches are experiencing that, as not just our churches, but the vast majority of Christendom is experiencing that in the United States, not elsewhere in the world, but here in the United States. We're going to talk about those options. And again, as I said earlier, we're going to really focus on the idea of a model that shares a pastor. And so there are other options I'm going to bring up, but this focus will be on the idea that you have one pastor leading two different congregations, and how that might work, and some of the challenges, pros and cons, how you could begin that conversation if you're not already in a partnership with another church. And we'll talk about some of the resources around that. Also want to just welcome my co-presenters today who have been working with me on this workshop. I want to thank them for their wisdom and their time. You're going to be hearing from each of them at different parts, some more than others, but I really did want to thank them. That's going to be the Reverend Lauren Kane, the Reverend Kevin Fruchtel, and the Reverend Steve Myron, who I think is here, but I'm not sure. He should be here in a few minutes, if not already here. And they have been working with me, and they've got experience. In fact, you're going to be hearing testimony from them. There's an old Southern Baptist. I'm a former Southern Baptist. An old Southern Baptist. They're going to hear. You're going to get testimony from them about their experience as pastors serving two churches, and they're also going to share some experience from their local churches. They got feedback about what the experience was like actually having sharing a pastor between two or three different congregations. All right, so I appreciate that. And what I want to do today is actually talk a little bit about the sort of current state of clergy availability of full-time and part-time positions in the United Church of Christ. And again, I think overall in terms of Christendom. So I was at General Synod this past year, this past summer, And if you, those of us who are synod junkies know that Pilgrim Press often puts together a little booth and they give out books or older books, or sometimes they present their newer books. And of course, the Pilgrim Press is the longest continuously printing press in the history of the United States, something to be proud of as part of the United Church of Christ, including not just religious texts, but actually printing company in the world, in the United States. And so one of the things that I looked through their old books that they were giving away was this book, which I just thought, well, hello. This was published in 1980. And the concern of the authors here, who were looking over the research in late 70s, was this sense that it looked as if there were going to be too many clergy for the churches that were available. Now, obviously, there were a lot more churches back then, but what they saw was a rise in seminarians coming in the 70s, and they were anticipating more in the 80s. And so their dilemma is, well, how do we handle all this influx of clergy coming in, and will there be enough churches for them to be able to serve, and what are we doing, and how should we handle this? And of course, the dilemma some 43 years later is quite the opposite. And there may have been that flux. I would love to see the statistics. I have not seen them before, but I'd love to have seen those statistics and see what it looks like. So hold on one second. I'm going to do something really quick. All right, I'll make sure I'm pinning myself right here for the video's sake. So that book was obviously kind of an anomaly. That was a telling moment when there was concern that there would be too much availability. But one of the things we wanted to do when I was, Bree did some wonderful work, Bree Rarick did some wonderful work in sort of seeing what's happening in terms of clergy availability. Okay, and so I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint that I've shared in other places, but I hope you'll stick with me to sort of give you a sense of what's going on here real quick. I'm going to quickly share something. All right. For those of you on the screen here, this is some research that she did that is was presented actually to our conference, our annual meeting here in the PSEC. And one of this first sort of slide is to show you the age of the clergy right now in our setting. 56% of the PSEC churches have at least one pastor age 60 plus. For every pastor serving a church that's younger than 62, there's another pastor serving a church older than 62. I want you to look here look at for us in our area, we have one clergy who is in their 20s, and actually he just about to turn 30. So we're going to lose out on that 20 category. And so you could see how 11 in their 30s, 22 in their 40s, 16, I'm in my 50s, I'm one of that cohort, but the spike here around 60s right now, the amount of clergy in their 60s and the 24 that are serving churches in their 70s right now, and 3 that are serving currently right now in their 80s. These are extraordinary numbers in a lot of ways. We knew that the clergy was aging, but we really have the proof now in terms of the numbers here in our conference. The other thing I'm going to highlight this right here. So in the United Church of Christ, the way that ministers are, they seek new positions is they often will create a profile now online. That's their clergy profile. It's their resume. They put together their sort of, all the things they need to do. They get it validated and they circulate it to different conferences. And when a person like me says, I want to circulate my profile, I click off all the conferences I want for that profile to be able to be seen. So in our conference in 2018, 230 profiles were received, okay? That means somewhere, some pastor in Wyoming said, I want them to be able to look at my profile. They may never have applied for a church, not seriously considering our church. They may have clicked every conference because they want to do a nationwide search, but we've had no real indication necessarily. Some have intentionally said, here's the region I want to serve. So even just the sort of blanket 230 profiles received doesn't mean 230 clergy resumes received or profiles were received by particular churches. We received 230 in 2018. In 2022, we received 155. And I know in some of our other conferences, even more difficult across Pennsylvania. And so it is just shows you again, this remarkable downturn in clergy availability. So one of the things that also needs to be kept in mind is that, when I was at Epiphany United Church of Christ in Chicago, when I was searching in 2011, was eventually called to that church, one of the things that the search team told me later on is that they received 88 profiles for that one position. Now, it's a wonderful church, north side of Chicago, a great neighborhood, great parsonage, strong congregation. And I was stunned, frankly, that they had that many. But I talked to somebody recently, even in this conference, who said 10 years ago, we received 50 plus profiles. And the reality is, nowadays, we did the statistics and we did an average, we looked over this and we found that in 2018, a church who was paying full-time settled pastor position, paying conference guidelines, which means they were trying to meet those guidelines that we set out that are recommendations for the financial guidelines for what churches should pay their pastors, had attendance of roughly 50 to 100, which nowadays is really solid, actually, anything above 50 in a lot of places. In 2018, we received 16 profiles for that kind of church, for that fitting that profile. In 2022, we received 9 profiles. So that's a sobering note. For us in the PSCC, members in discernment are folks who are on a track towards ordination. They've been given an official status within our denomination, member in discernment. In 2018, we had 22 members in discernment. In 2023, we've had 10. Some of them who are on this call are about to get off of this list of MIDs, and not a lot of folks that we know of. One of the interesting things that I think for those of you who have long histories in the church, one of the great phenomenons, and what a blessing to the church, is that we for years were able to sort of as young people were not going into seminary and then choosing to go into parish ministry, we were blessed with second or third career clergy who would come in and serve the church. Well, though that pipeline has sort of shut down as well. I mean, there's certainly members or clergy that are coming in later in their careers, later in their lives, but it's not as great as it was in the 80s and the 90s and probably the early 2000s, when there was this ability to sort of make up the difference between those who were not available. And then in our conference, we have 5 associations. 44% of the churches in the conference have or are searching for a full-time pastor that would not be shared with another congregation. So here also is this listing of full-time churches by association. Covenant at 46, North Penn at 55, Philadelphia at 55, Schuylkill at 25%, and Ursinus at 46. The overall amount of part-time churches who have part-time clergy is actually now 56% in our conference. And in other places, I'm sure it's actually probably higher. So you can get a sense of sort of the state of search and call right now. I also wanted to give you, I'm gonna put something in the link real quick here that I want you to go ahead and bookmark for you as well. And I want to show you as well here on what I would ask you to do is, this is a click to a Google map that I'm going to share with you right now. I would ask you to, perhaps if you want to, you can certainly share it. This is a map of the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference and our churches. You can see here from Philadelphia going up to Schuylkill County and Bucks and Berks and other parts here as well, Montgomery. And the yellow are churches that have part-time pastors. The blues are those who employ a full-time pastor. So this is sort of the state. Look, if you look up here, up in the northern part, that's Schuylkill County. That's where that 25% we were talking about. You look here, obviously there in certain areas you have more in Philadelphia that are full-time, but even those are declining in terms of full-time pastorates. So one of the things that I think will be useful for you, if you go ahead and click on that link, and I would ask that you maybe click on it and bookmark it and come back to the Zoom meeting here, so that you get a real sense of what's around you and who is, what churches around you have part-time pastors, because it may end up being a tool for you to see if there are others who might really be willing to share a pastor with you, or begin a search in which you try to employ a full-time pastor between 2 different churches. So there's another resource I wanted to give to you as well. Kevin Fruchtel, will you do me a favor, and will you go ahead and make a list of those clergy that want credit for this while I'm speaking, so we make sure we don't, there's in the chat function there. If you could do, I appreciate that, Kevin, thanks. So part of this just reflects the state of numerical decline of formal Christianity in this country. I think we've all experienced, we've all seen it. We know, I mean, I'm probably repeating this for those who already know this, but I want to say it aloud. There has never probably been a time in American history where more people attended church than between 1946 and around 1965. And I mean, like going back to the founding of the Republic and before. I mean, perhaps in some places, but for the most part, the reality is that that was such a phenomenon post-war, this attempt to find stability, people trying, a huge amount of people coming back post-war, and having families and having children and looking for stability in their lives and finding a spiritual center in their local congregation. It was such a phenomenon. And you can look at some of the building programs that happened in the 40s and 50s, sometimes even as early as the 30s. Where people were building Christian education wings, right? Because they had all these kids and they were, they assumed that they would always have this many kids. And the reality is by the mid 60s, between 65 and 70, things start to really clearly start to decline numerically. It had already been in decline probably from the early 60s on. It accelerated in the 70s and 80s. And this was something that it was especially happening for those of us in the mainline church. That is, those who are Presbyterian Church USA, the ELCA Lutherans, the RCA, the Reformed Church in America, the Disciples of Christ. We were all seeing it. Whereas our more evangelical, more conservative brothers and sisters, they saw some significant growth during that time. But what we and they did not realize was actually we were the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because a lot of our churches were rural, the reality of depopulation of small towns. And so what was happening to us in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and the 90s continue has now even reached our fellow sisters and brothers in Christ who come from more evangelical, more conservative traditions. I am a former Southern Baptist. I became a Christian at 13. I come from a non-religious background, but as I always tell, I had to ask my mother at 13, what are we? And she said, I think we're Southern Baptists. That's how non-religious we really were. So I said, take me to a Baptist church. Southern Baptists during my tenure were just going gangbusters in the 80s. While the main line was in decline, they were growing. And of course, the region was growing as well in terms of numbers. But in 2006, something happened to one of the most conservative denominations in our country. They also began to experience numerical decline, and they have been in numerical decline since 2006, going from 16.3 million to 13.2 million. And that's significant decline. Last year alone, they lost about 480,000 members. Okay, so what we're seeing here in the main line that was happening to us is now affecting almost all of Christendom. There's also the rise of what we call the nuns, those who, when you survey them about who they are and what they will believe and what tradition they claim, rather than saying kind of a blanket Christian or they are, they put on click that little box and say, I'm none of the above. I am not Christian, I'm not Hindu, I'm not Muslim, I'm not even atheist sometimes, because nuns doesn't mean that you don't have a spiritual life, you don't believe in God. It may mean that you just don't see the worth of organized religion, right? Or, I always say, we'll get to that in a second, but so that percentage, even in 20 years, I'm roughly remembering back in, 20 years ago, it was roughly around 6% of the population just clicked that box that said nuns. We're up to around 20 to 22% of the population. There are people that check none of the above more than there are evangelical Christians, mainline Christians. Evangelicals around 13.5% of the population, mainline are something like 10.5 or something like that, around 11% right now. The decline among evangelicals from a high of around 21% down to about 13.5, as I said, is an extraordinary phenomenon unto itself. So all across Christendom. And obviously, I don't want to pretend that there are not churches in your area that are growing. Of course, there are mainline churches that are growing, and there are evangelical churches that are growing. There are other religious communities that are growing. But the overall trend in this country is in decline in terms of churches or people who feel that there's any real value to walking beside other people on this journey, right? And entering into organized religion. So I would say the other point that we often see is the megachurch phenomenon. And again, that was one of my professors from seminary was Scott Thuma, who is probably now the most well-recognized expert on the megachurch phenomenon. We had a class with him years ago. A really interesting class. He was just getting his PhD at Emory, which is where I went to seminary. And it was interesting as he was explaining the phenomenon. They were going gangbusters, and they are still, megachurches are growing. What we find now is that churches in the middle, that is, folks between the small churches are in decline, those in the middle are in decline. There is still growth on the megachurch end. The churches that normally would, so roughly 2,000 in attendance are up. There is still some decline, but even the numbers there have declined significantly. And there is great debate in the literature whether in many ways these are just Christians moving from one place to another. These are not new converts necessarily. They're just being either taken from smaller to medium-sized churches, or they're just being other mega churches, swapping members. But I have to say that there is some real numerical increase, though not on the size that it was in the 80s and the 90s and the early aughts. But I also want to say this, as much as this all seems sort of big, difficult news, and for those of us probably in the room, most of us are worshiping in small congregations. That is, churches, in the old days, it would have been under 100. Nowadays, I would say it's probably under 50. 50 to 100 seems solid nowadays in mainline churches. But the reality is, historically, in America, the vast majority of Christians have actually worshiped in small congregations. So I think in many ways, as we see larger churches, they're the anomaly. They're the odd ones out, because historically, even in the 19th and 20th century, most of us worshiped in small congregations. And I would say across Christendom, over 2,000 years, that's the case. Though I would say this, and this is really pertinent to what we're talking about here, they may have been maybe worshiping in smaller congregations, but they were likely not being served by a solo pastor, meaning one pastor dedicated to so-and-so UCC or so-and-so church. The reality is, if you look at the 19th century, most churches were probably, especially in the rural areas like this, a lot of them were being served by a pastor that had, a 3-point charge, or they maybe serve one church. They'd go on the first Sunday to Waka Waka Church and so-and-so to so-and-so church. And they would, often if they were close enough, maybe they were able to serve the church on the same morning. And I often think the reality of what's happening now is perhaps just going back to the model that was there in the 19th and 17th century, where we had pastors serving multiple congregations. Sometimes because of different Sundays they would come in, but other times, oftentimes more lay-led than we have right now in terms of that. The strong expectation that the clergy takes care of all these sorts of things. But I also want to say, I want to make a case for church in a weird way. Now, all of us are here because we believe in church, right? We believe in the idea that the spiritual life is something that's meant to be done together. And I will argue to the end of my days, as much as I have lovely friends who are Christians, but who are not part of an organized community or a spiritual group where they have fellow companions, intentional companions on the spiritual journey towards Christ, or wherever, or however they understand that, that Christianity especially is a religion of us. And it is not a religion of just me and Jesus. And in some ways, that was the shadow side of my own tradition, my former tradition, and Southern Baptist side, which was always, there was a sense of that personal relationship with Jesus, which I still hold dearly and completely experience. But the reality is, the church really is this phenomenon of us. Right? Us getting together, knowing that we need each other for the journey. And so there is real value in being a part of an us. The other side of this, it's my joke, and there's nothing worse than organized religion. Anybody who's ever experienced church hurt, the craziness of how church can split on the color of a carpet. There's so much dysfunction in many ways. There's nothing worse than organized religion, except, I would argue, disorganized religion. Because in many ways, disorganized religion, where there's no clear lines of authority, nobody's held accountable, clergy are not held accountable, there's no structure in which we can walk with each other formally if we need each other, there's no help from anybody than our independent solo church. The reality is, that's, I would argue, even worse. And I have a story about that, but we don't got time for that right now. The other people is this. I would say this, one of the things in our culture right now that is a sad phenomenon is that we are, of course, incredibly politically divided. And you know, what has happened within the church in the last 20 years is that we Christians, for the most part, have started sort of self-sorting. We have decided that it is probably for a lot of us that it's really better to worship with those that we politically agree with. And so we start going to the church where the pastor is going to say a negative word about the candidate we don't like, or a positive word about the candidate we do like, or values that we have. There's not a lot of room for diversity because everyone agrees that voting for Trump or voting for Biden is what God would want you to do. But the truth of the matter is, churches nowadays are one of the few places in our lives where people who really definitely disagree with each other about what should be next for our country, what values we should hold, is one of the few places where we actually get to be together, that we get to look at each other across the aisle and say, you know what, I think your politics are bad, but I love you, brother. And I know that if I needed you, you would be there for me. That is not, there are not a lot of spaces left anymore around that. There are not a lot of places where we can be with each other, claim the same Lord, and really disagree about what that Lord asks of us in the public realm. This matters for the sake of our country and for the sake of the church. That's what scares me about this self-sorting that has happened within the church, which is everybody goes to their conservative church, everybody goes to a liberal church, and there's some value in that for those of us who don't want to relive some church trauma, and I get that. But our churches, especially in the mainstream tradition, us in the UCC, the Presbyterians and Lutherans, we are one of the few places now where we can get together and still love each other and see the value of each other. And I'm going to say that to the end of my days. That's why, amongst many other reasons, the church matters. That's one. The biggest reason I say the church matters, other than it is the body of Christ in this world, which is the basic, reality. We are Christ in the world. Is the idea that the church is the one place in our lives, out of all the places in our lives, where we are asked to do one profound thing, which is to learn how to love. There are not a lot of places in our lives in which we are asked simply to learn how to love. The church says, come here, learn how to love God and learn how to love each other. Right? Those are the two great commandments. And those are the two fundamental things we're asked to do. I love the Kiwanis Club. I love my local Rotary. I love the so-and-so. And they're great organizations doing great work, sometimes greater work in the world than the local church or churches. But they're not there to learn how to love each other. They're there to do good in the world. And that's a good thing. Don't think I'm dismissing that. But the church is the one place we're asked to come here and to learn how to live with each other and love each other despite our great differences, and to claim our Lord, our Jesus, as the one thing that binds us together. So I'm going to argue again to the end of my days, until they shut me up in that coffin someday or burn me up in that thing. I would argue that the church is special that way. So there's a reason why your church matters, because it does something that no other thing does in our culture, which is here's how to love. Here's how to love each other. Here's how to learn how to love each other, both God and people. So I want to move into a section really quickly, and I appreciate your patience with this. I want to talk about what are our options nowadays. The reality is, I've said, I've given you the numbers. I've talked about the phenomenon of what's going on in terms of churches. And I wanted to give you 4 basic options about what we could do in a season of numerical decline. And I want to point out something. Numerical decline is not spiritual decline. Okay. There are a lot of churches that have less members than they did 20 years ago, but are stronger spiritually than they were 20 years ago. They may not be able to do as much as they did 20 years ago, but their connection to what really matters, which of course is Jesus and God, and to each other, is strong as it ever has been, if not stronger. Okay. So I don't ever think of numerical decline as spiritual decline. And so I'm going to really make that case. So there are plenty of strong churches that are small in number. Okay. So 4 basic options I want to point out to you today. One is, let's say we're a church that has less resources than we did 10 years ago. One of the models you could go is, let's just continue to do a model in which we either can hire somebody full-time or part-time and ask him or her to serve solely that church. A lot of our churches still do that. There are plenty of our churches that I showed you on that have one pastor serving that church on a part-time basis. Sometimes that's because the church can only afford that. Sometimes it's because the pastor feels like that's what he or she is up to at that point, right? Is willing to do or able to do because of their own life circumstances. And that's the reality. That is an option to continue to go forward and say, our pattern has been this. We will continue to have a pastor who solely serves our congregation. And you can certainly do that. I am going to tell you honestly, there are going to be a lot less pastors who are going to be able to do that, especially if they continue to have to make a living as a full-time pastor, that they don't find themselves later in retirement, who perhaps are serving a church a quarter time, third time, half time in a particular setting because they want to, because sometimes they need to, right? There are just less of them. And you saw that 60 and up phenomenon. We're just going to have less of those because time, right? So I think that's an obvious model that you can continue to do. That's your choice. One of the great things about the United Church of Christ is that, local church polity, which is one of the things I really love about our denomination. We can make those choices. Unlike the Methodists, the bishop can go around and say, you three churches over there, you're going to be put into a charge and you're going to share Pastor Marty. And she's going to be your pastor, and you're going to work your times together to make sure that she can be with you every Sunday at 8 o'clock, 9:30, and 11 or 11:30, whatever. That's not how we work, and that's not how we roll. And in many ways, that's how Methodism, and because they had a very top-down control, they actually did have the ability to sustain much smaller congregations for a lot longer time, though they too are struggling now in terms of the lack of clergy availability and being able to serve those small churches. So option number one, stay steady, continue to just try to find a solo pastor to serve us, and we'll just go with that because we really want him or her to sort of only be serving our congregation. The other option, number two, is the idea of merging with another church. Now, we have some workshops. Sean James, the Reverend Sean James, who is our Associate Conference Minister for Congregational Development, he has done a couple of great workshops called Better Together, which he talks about the pros and cons of doing a church merger. He does them usually at least once a year. I think we had one last year, and we'll probably have one this year, and we'll probably have one next year as well. And that is where a church decides, let's get together. There are two churches that are, 10 miles away from each other. We've decided we're going to go ahead and see if we can merge our churches together. And one of the things that is a real possibility. And there are churches in our setting right now. I'm going to actually post a video real quick of two pastors that shared their experience doing that very thing in our conference. And it's Ben Moats and Pastor Marietta Most, I think is her last name. And they gave a little workshop on this, and that I think is a really, really helpful. They talk about the challenges. And here again is a video you might want to bookmark for later on, where you get to hear them talk about that. I don't have a video for Pastor Sean James's workshop, Better Together. But it is something that you might want to look at as you contemplate the idea of doing a formal merger with another congregation. That means that you become one church, that you let go of some of your identity. This church went from two particular churches that had a long history to a church now meeting in one of the buildings, having a new name, and then in this particular setting, having a pastor that served 75% and 75% of his call was, the church was what. The two pastors ended up serving both congregations. They have two pastors, but one serves 15% and the other serves 85%. Or I know exactly so they've worked it out, right? I do think this is a real reality. I think I will say the hard part of this always, as you can imagine, is who gets the building, how are we going to do this, what pastor do we keep, and the phenomena that Sean talks about is this too. And I think he's right about this, as difficult as it is to hear. He often says, and he is a church Salt and Light pastor, a pastor of Salt and Light in in Philadelphia. And he talks about, one of the things that happened with the church merger that he had, in his setting was that one church had this huge empty building. The other church, his church, was growing by leaps and bounds, and they needed a building, right? So it worked out in the sense of they both had what they needed. But one of the things, and the other church had a big building with no people in it, and hardly any people in it, right? And so one of the things that was really clear when you do a church merger, one of the churches has to be fairly strong, meaning financially strong, numerically strong, spiritually strong. The other church is probably going to be one that is struggling more. A merger cannot be it's probably not going to be successful if both churches are struggling. It's not, quote, a solution in many ways, right? It's not the panacea. So there's nothing wrong with saying at a church that what about a merger? That sometimes the roadblock is a church who perhaps really does need the merger, and they don't want to be, quote, the lesser partner in a merger. And so there's a real struggle with that. And so there have been churches that turn down that they're like, we have to be equal partners. Well, the reality is one church is growing numerically, growing financially. The other church is struggling. Ways of doing things are probably going to fall to the church that's been doing it well or doing it in terms of growth. And so that's some of the things that come up. But I do want to say it can be done. It's shown to be successful in many settings, and it's something that can be an option. Okay. It does require a lot more work. There's a lot of emotional work that comes with it, a lot of spiritual work that comes with it, but it is a real option. The third option is what we're really going to talk about today, which is the easier of the four options I'm going to give you. And that third option is sharing a pastor. That the phenomenon now again of we as pastors, a lot of us do have to make a full-time living. I've got, not me necessarily. I was going to say I've got kids to support. I've got dogs to support. So, so I got student loans to pay off, whatever, what I'm saying? I have a mortgage and I have to make sure I can put my dogs through college, right? So the reality is that a lot of us still have to make a full-time living, but there are less positions that are full-time anymore. And churches are not able to afford full-time ministers anymore. 56% of our churches are part-time. Well, for a lot of our pastors, those 56% of those churches are not on the radar in terms of being able to serve them because they need a full-time position, okay, with benefits. So what this idea that we're talking about here in terms of sharing a pastor is a pastor Kevin would serve 2 or 3 churches. The church would work. Each church would contribute a certain amount to his or her salary, meaning a financial. One church will pay 50%, the other will pay 50%. Sometimes it might be a little more uneven, but it could be depending on the package that is put together in terms of what their financial capability is. But that church shares a pastor who normally, as I think Kevin's going to point, is normally would preach at the same church or 2 different churches on the same Sunday. Okay, she or he would go at different times and go preach and lead worship in those settings, and then do pastoral care across 2 churches. This can be done a couple of ways. One is that basically the pastor or the churches find a pastor who might be willing to serve them while serving another church, but there's no real connection between those 2 churches. They're not necessarily entering into agreement with each other. They're just saying, Kevin, we're going to hire you for this amount of money. And the other church says, we've already hired you, or we're going to hire you for this amount of money, and you put it together, and that's the pay package, right? And putting those 2 things together can make a full-time package for a minister, can make it a living wage for a pastor who has all the needs everyone else does. So that's one way of doing it. They have no formal agreement. They have no formal connection with each other, except hopefully their love of Christ and their mutual willingness to share a pastor. There's another option within that subset, which is the idea of churches actually agreeing to a formal agreement to share a pastor, which Pastor Kevin Fruchtel will talk to you about. And they're able to enter into a much more formal agreement about what is the responsibility of one church, the other church, and it's a much more formal agreement. This is a great way of making sure that there's no misunderstanding about who takes care of what. Or if there's a conflict that arises around time, oftentimes having a shared ministry agreement, which is what we call it, is where, Pastor so-and-so is spending more time at so-and-so church, and we're concerned about that. This is a way in which some of those things can be spelled out, and there can also be a way of spelling out how that might be resolved within the shared ministry agreement. So the three pastors we're going to talk with in a few minutes, one of which serves a church with a shared ministry. And David's, sorry, David, I see your dog. I love dogs. So yeah, there you go. You got dogs to support, as they said. So one of our churches, Kevin Fructal, serves a church with a shared ministry agreement. Two churches that have decided to enter in a formal agreement about sharing Pastor Kevin. One of our churches, one of Pastor Steve Myron serves two churches that have no formal agreement that ended up, and he'll tell the story of how all that happened. They have no agreement other than the fact they have employed Pastor Stephen. They're exploring some things, and he'll talk about that. And then the third person who will be speaking is the Reverend Lauren Kane, and we'll talk about that in a second. Reverend Lauren Kane is somebody who is currently serving a UCC church and also a Lutheran church. Both churches are half-time. And we'll talk about how that might happen as well, and the resourcing we can give you in terms of what is available in a certain area in which you might be serving, where maybe the LCA has a church that needs a part-time pastor. And maybe we can work with them to see what are the churches in the areas that we can possibly put together a position or two positions that will make up for a full-time salary. All right, so those are some of the options there, and that's three with two subsets. The fourth, I would say, is this, and we've got to say it, and we got to say it aloud. The fourth option is and this is a noble and it's a real option, is ending your ministry, closing your church, becoming a legacy church, we call it in the United Church of Christ. And I think we have to say it aloud. We do workshops for churches that are contemplating the end of their ministry. And we just did one last year. We're probably going to do one this year. And there are resources in which churches find themselves in a place where it is really clear that they cannot numerically continue, they cannot financially continue, and it is time to end their ministry. I do want to say, and I've often said this, well, first of all, I want to give you a confession. The first church I ever served, the first church that ever called me in Spokane, Washington, is now closed. Now, nothing breaks my heart to realize that the first place that took a gamble on me, I was a half-time pastor, and they hired me and good things happened during that tenure. But because of circumstances that happened far after I left, they ended up closing. And it breaks my heart to think that those folks, I can't go back. I can't ever go back to see them. And so the reality, though, is that I want to say Emmanuel in Spokane, their closure was not a failure. Every season, every life is but for a season, right? But for a time. And closing is not failure. Ending your ministry is just ending your ministry. It comes fraught with all the pain and hurt of something around the end of life. When we die, dying is not a failure on our part, right? We can never say that. Of course, as Christians especially. So it's really important to keep that in mind is if this is one of those things that you need to seriously think about. And I also remind people that, the churches in Galatia, they're all closed. The churches at Corinth, they've closed. They've ended their ministry centuries ago. So again, were they of no use? Did they not do their work in the world? Yes, they did. Just because they didn't last for 2,000 years doesn't mean that they did not do the work that God had called them to do. And again, as a pastor who has served churches in which the numbers grew, finances grew, as a pastor who served congregations where we declined in attendance, we declined in finances and capability. One of the things I've had to often say, and I think this is true for the church, in the great getting up morning, there's my Southern Baptist side, the great getting up morning when we go before the Lord, the reality is God's not going to ask Kevin or you or me, tell me the numbers. Give me the numbers. Did your church grow? Did it decline? Did you make a huge impact on the world? The fundamental thing that God is going to ask us, I think, on that, before the great throne is, were you faithful? Were you faithful to the gospel as it was given to you? And that's all we're accountable for. And churches who have to end their ministries, that's what they're going to be held accountable for. I will say to you, one of the things that I think is important as you contemplate this that it's important to be intentional around your closing, to not find yourself all of a sudden 2 months out realizing you need to close. And one of the things that we really say to folks, and I was talking to a colleague of mine in the Southern New England Conference who does a lot of work around churches who end their ministry. And one of the things I say is that if you get to a point where you have less than $50,000 in the bank in terms of reserves, and every month it keeps going down, you're at a place where you've got to close. Because unless there's some miracle coming out of somewhere, because it takes a lot to close a church. It takes a lot legally to close a church. It takes a lot financially to close a church. The lawyers get involved. The state of Pennsylvania gets involved. There's a lot of stuff to ending your ministry. Think about when we die. Dying is not cheap. Being dead is not cheap. We all know what it means to go to a funeral home and have to, pay a certain amount to end that, to complete the circle. Okay. So be intentional about where you are in terms of finances, or in the terms of the numbers who are coming in your church. Be in prayer, give it time. The conference can help you in that work. We have folks that are willing to work with you, including myself and Pastor Bill Worley and others in the conference who have experience. And we have workbooks, we have ways of making sure that we can help you. It is a valid and okay and good choice to say our ministry is ended. It is not failure. It's just the end of ministry in our setting. So those are the four options that I wanted to share with you this morning. The other thing I just want to say before I'm going to hand it off, where we're going to start a little bit about talking about some breakout rooms here, where I'm going to ask you to kind of gather together briefly for about 20 minutes to talk about your own settings and what you're thinking about. The fundamental thing I would say in this day and age, and it probably should have always been this way, is the fundamental question is, do we need to do this ministry alone? Why are we doing it alone? Why can't we share it with another congregation? When I was in Chicago, there was a church, Ravenswood United Church of Christ, and my church, Epiphany. We were roughly within 1.5 miles of each other. They didn't have a lot of youth. We had a lot of youth. They had some children. We had more children. But the reality is, the first thing we did together, Pastor Jason and I, we talked on the phone and said, let's do a youth group together. There were years where they had no youth in there that they could contribute to our youth group. There were years when they had no confirmands that they could share. But Pastor Jason and I shared that confirmation class together for a decade. So I would say to you in many ways that to begin the work, that why did we, and we could have just been soloed. I had the youth that I could have done the youth group alone. We had the youth that we could have done confirmation alone. But the point is to share, to try to find ways in which we can do this together. So do we have to do this by ourselves? Can we do something together, even on a fundamental level? Are there ways, and one of those fundamental ways is, can we share a pastor with another congregation? So my mantra that I'm going to end this section with is this, around that sharing. I will argue, again, here's the third thing I'll argue into my grave as they put me down, is this: the future is shared. This phenomenon of the church being the solo entity in which we kind of just go it alone and do our own thing, and we're going to be an entity by ourselves with sort of loose connections to everybody else, that era is ending. And it was an era of the 20th century in which all of a sudden the churches could afford full-time pastors or a robust half-time pastor. The reality is we are now back into the 19th century, where we're going to decide whether or not sharing is a possibility. But I don't know if it's a possibility. It's just something that's going to be a reality. The future is shared. So I really want you I would invite you to imprint that in your brain in terms of that. I'm going to open it up for very brief questions here because I want to guess the breakout rooms. Are there any questions that you might have? They may be answered a little later in this workshop.
One question that I have is, if you are going to do a shared ministry, and you were doing it with a different congregation that's not UCC, does it need to be like, I know we have arrangements with the Lutheran Church. Would it have to be some minister that is related to the UCC?
You mean whether that no, it could be let's say it's a Lutheran pastor, perhaps, right? So let's say there's a Lutheran pastor that is willing to serve a UCC church 2 miles away, or how many miles away. Yes, I mean, what we would do in that situation was normally we would seek to have them give them standing in the United Church of Christ, so that they would have some formal connection with us, with the Committee on Ministry. But certainly an ELCA pastor, a Presbyterian pastor, can serve UCC church. We'll talk about this in a second later on in my workshop, where we talk about formula agreement and our special relationships with certain denominations. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Caroline.
Thank you. I guess I just wondered, to your point about the youth group, and maybe you're going to get into this later on. Like how should you start down the road on collaborating, assuming that you're not in that option where there's, no arrangements between anyone, no connection, and it's up to the pastor? I mean, do you have worship together once a month? Do you try to do some musical programs together? I mean, I guess I was, without going on too long, but and how long in advance? Because I know I've been to other offerings from PSCC, and they do talk about the fact that the worst thing, and Sean talks about it, is that if you just kind of throw yourselves together at some point and there's really been no collaboration, to lead up to things.
Well, I think that's especially true with a merger. And he's absolutely right with that. But I would say, in terms of what we did in Chicago, we picked up the phone. Our pastors, I picked up the phone, he picked up the phone. We talked to each other. We said, let's do this. We went to our consistory and say, what about sharing our youth groups together? And everybody was enthusiastic on both ends, because that increased the size of the youth group. It always made sure that we had, almost every year at Epiphany, we had a confirmation class. And so there was always, folks coming in, and there was enthusiasm around that. So that, I think, and I'll talk about this later, and I'm going to get to Kevin will talk about this, but I would argue the simplest base model right now, the easiest thing to do, is to share a pastor right now. You can talk about merger later on. You can talk about other options later on. But if you can just get to a place of just sharing a pastor with or without a shared ministry agreement, just out of necessity and out of desire to continue your ministry, and of course, with the caveat that you're not just continuing for survival's sake, but you're continuing to do ministry, that would be the sort of base level for me. So I think there can be informal and formal congregations around sharing at the beginning, but I would say, and we'll get to that. Kevin's going to our three folks who are going to speak are going to give us some background on that. So Carolyn, just be patient. And if you don't hear from me at the end, you can certainly call me out on that. Okay. All right. Again, thank you for joining us here. And this part of the session we're going to talk about is, I'm going to hand it off to one of my wonderful colleagues who shares an incredible name with me. His name is the Reverend Kevin Fruchtel, and he's going to talk a little bit about sharing a pastor, the pros and the cons, the challenges. And then after that, I'll be introducing three of our speakers who'll give you about 10 minutes apiece in terms of, from their perspective, how, as a pastor, how it's worked. And then later on, they'll also share with you the perspective of some of their consistories about how it has and hasn't worked, what they felt was rich about it, what was not. So I'm going to hand this over to Kevin Fruchtel here. And I'll pin you real quick.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, I'm Pastor Kevin Fruchtel. I am the pastor of St. Mark's United Church of Christ up in Cressona, Schuylkill Association. I've been pastor there for 5 years. I'm also now in a covenanted ministry agreement with St. John's United Church of Christ in Schuylkill Haven, and have been there for, almost 3 years. And so had the opportunity to journey through the process and figure out where some of the potholes were. And I have the chance to share that experience a little bit with you. A couple of things that I want to lift up, if you're considering a shared ministry agreement, is it's incredibly important to recognize that this is a way to enhance ministry. If you're only looking at it as a way to keep the doors open, then perhaps you need to consider some additional options, because as I journeyed through this process, it was really helping congregations to understand that this is a way to do ministry, that we are called to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and to share it with our communities. And if all we're doing is trying to make sure that we got the insurance paid and we're going to keep the doors open, then this may not be the best option. I would encourage you, if you're thinking about any of this, to try to be proactive. We made the decision, I say we, our two congregations made the decision before we felt like it was the only option. We actually had the freedom to choose and say that this is a way that we can do ministry better, instead of saying, oh my God, we got payroll coming up and I'm not quite sure how we're going to meet it. And I know that's not always a luxury that congregations have, but we were blessed in being able to say, this is something we're going to do intentionally to be able to try to help both congregations do ministry better. And please don't think that, you got to be down to 5 or 10 in the pews on a Sunday morning before this becomes an option. St. Mark's, post-COVID, is doing about 50 to 60 people in the pews on a Sunday morning. St. John's is doing about 40 to 50 on a Sunday morning. And so we're talking about, we're not talking about being down to the wire here. We're talking about congregations with memberships of 300 and 200 who felt that they would be able to do ministry better together. And so please don't feel like you got to wait to the last minute. There are ways that you can do this where two congregations that are relatively strong, but still recognizing that the trends are that we need to look at some other options. I would also encourage you, and this came up in our breakout room, to try to be as positive as you can in coming into this by really looking at it as this is an opportunity for two congregations to be able to do life and worship and ministry and whatever it is that we're doing, to do it better. And really, this is an opportunity, not a defeat. We had one of the ladies in our breakout room talk about how, we have folks in our congregation who have stated that if we have to go to part-time, then that's just the path that we're on. That's the slippery slope into nothingness. But the reality of it is, there are so many more benefits than just the fact that you're able to share a pastor. And I'm going to be able to get into that shortly. If you're having this conversation with your leadership, and I'm talking both to pastors and the lay folks who are here today, recognize that this is not about what are we losing. It is truly about what are we going to be able to gain. And I cannot emphasize this enough. And I shared this at the at Penn Southeast Conference when I was talking a tiny little bit. I had a couple of folks from both congregations ask me, well, how are you going to be able to love both congregations? You started at St. Mark's, and now you're talking about going to St. John's as well. Can you love two congregations? Mm-hmm. And I responded by saying, I have two boys. Jake is 4 years older than Ben. Mm-hmm. And when Ben was born, I certainly didn't look at Jacob and say, sorry, kid, I can't love you anymore. I got another one. You find the ways and you find the opportunities to recognize that each congregation has their skills and their gifts. So if you're going to do it, if you can, be proactive, be positive, and truly it requires a level of flexibility. And it requires some different understandings of pastoral ministry. Specific example, one of the things that we're working on right now, believe it or not, is office time. Because there are some folks who think that they should be able to wander in during business hours any day of the week and expect that I'm going to be sitting in my chair waiting for them to arrive. And it's just folks have to recognize that that's a shift in the perspective. My cell phone number is published, my email is published. I have administrative assistants in both congregations who know where I am before I do. And so it's a process of just helping helping congregational folks to recognize that I may not always be sitting in my office waiting for them to arrive. But if they call me and say, hey, I'm coming in Monday at 10 o'clock, you bet doggone well I'm going to be in my chair. And so it's a process of helping congregations to recognize that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. All right, so what definitions are we operating on here for shared ministry? A pastor will serve 2 or more congregations. My experience is with serving 2, with worship services most often held at every church, every Sunday, led by me, unless I happen to be down at Hatteras with my toes in the sand, and we get people to cover it from there. There's sometimes the impression that I'm only doing, one Sunday, one congregation, and one Sunday at another congregation. And in this arrangement, that is not the case. You have worship in your sanctuary on a Sunday morning. The goal is to have 2 or more churches. Again, I'm operating with 2, contributing enough to employ a pastor full-time with benefits according to Penn Southeast Conference compensation guidelines. And I'm going to get shortly into talking about why that's so incredibly important. One of the things that I tried to lift up with the 2 congregations that I'm serving right now, at least in my twisted brain, I really and truly view it as being full-time over 2 ministry sites. I recognize that my time is limited because I am serving 2 congregations, but it's not like I have another part-time job where I am bound to, I don't know, checking out groceries at the Giant because I have to supplement my income. Whereas if I'm on shift there from 6 to 12, that means I can't go to the hospital if I get an emergency call. The fact that I'm serving 2 congregations for me is incredibly important because that means I can maximize my time. And if I'm in the hospital, I'm catching folks from both congregations. Folks are living in similar places. And so, I'm able to do my home visits. And I got to be honest with you, I'm getting to the point now where half the time I got to think twice to remember which congregation they're actually from. And so there is a synergy that takes place because I am full-time over 2 sites. One of the things that it absolutely requires, and this was part of our conversation at our breakout, it absolutely requires an understanding of what do we most expect our pastor to do and be. What am I best trained to do and be? And if I remember correctly, that was, and you can help me out, Kevin, if I screw it up, that was preach, teach, provide pastoral care, and provide administrative support when needed. And that is the biggest part of my job description, as I call it. It then requires folks to say, if we're going to be in a shared ministry, that may mean that some lay folks have to step up and do some things that they're better equipped to do anyway. And I've spent a lot of time teaching out of Corinthians 12, which, if you don't totally remember, that is, we are one body and we have many different gifts. And though we are different parts of the body, we are one, and we all bring something to the table. And I've had folks step up and do wonderful things because they recognize that this is not just a ministry where we're going to sit around and watch the pastor do parlor tricks on a Sunday morning. It's the ministry where we're going to step together and we're going to be the body of Christ, and we are going to do it together. I have to say that this has been an incredibly energizing process. And I speak for myself and I speak for both congregations because it kind of shifted from, oh my God, how are we going to make it at 2 congregations that we're looking at 3/4 time, to now 1 congregation or 2 congregations that are joining in some way. And while they're in separate buildings, separate consistories, separate decision-making processes, separate financial processes, and separate worship times, but they are now stronger together. And I'll echo Kevin's mantra, the future is shared. Some of the things that we have really benefited from, some of the incredible strengths, has been 2 congregations getting to know each other. And again, I'm speaking more now towards the covenanted ministry process, not just pastor showing up on a Sunday morning doing worship and bailing out. We've gotten a chance to explore ministry ideas with each other. Someone lifted up in our breakout that, well, we can't, we're having trouble getting lay people to do stuff now. If we have a pastor that's doing less hours, how are we going to get anything done? But what I'm finding now is with small groups from both congregations working on stuff, I've got stewardship teams that are referencing each other. I've got worship teams that are worshiping each other. I've got people asking each other, how are you working with this? What are you doing with this? It's actually enhanced the ministry of both congregations. Another one of the gifts, quite honestly, and I'm not great with math, but this one's pretty easy. The average for a pastoral compensation package, when you cover for salary and housing or just straight salary, when you factor in the United Church of Christ Family Health Plan, and you look at insurance, and most of you probably know this already, just for nice, easy numbers, you're looking at probably $100,000. And that's if, that's low end of average when you factor in everything else. When you take that and say, all right, we got, instead of two congregations laying out 100,000, or that wonderful thing that I've never totally figured out, 3/4 time, because I have never figured out how to do 3/4 time. I don't even know if it exists. Anyway, when you have it, instead of two congregations laying out that incredible amount of money, you have two congregations coming together, taking my compensation package, splitting it completely in half. We didn't bother trying to take the time about how much time you're going to spend here, how much time you're going to spend there. We look at it as full-time over 2 sites. They split my compensation package completely in half. It has freed up resources for both congregations to do ministry more effectively, instead of trying to figure out, oh my God, how are we going to pay to have the pastor? And it's freed me up, because my clergy colleagues out there, in a moment of absolute candor, how many times have you sat through budget meetings and you've sat through your good folks trying to figure out how much you're worth, instead of saying, all right, well, let's just try to figure this out together? And so there's more stability from a call perspective and more stability from a pastoral perspective, knowing that two congregations are sharing that responsibility, and that it frees me up to be able to do the things that I'm supposed to do. And it's forward focused. If we're going to look at shared ministry opportunities, it is forward focused. And so don't wait until you feel like you're at the last minute, because I guarantee you that we are not going back to how many of our congregations remember what ministry looked like. We're not going back to full-time pastor, and we can still pay that pastor and still do everything else that we want to do. This is where it's going, whether we like it or don't like it. And managing the process effectively ahead of time is tremendously important. So that's some of the gifts, some of the struggles that can come out of this process. There are always going to be concerns about perception regarding the amount of time that a pastor may spend with one congregation or another congregation. Oh my God, he's hanging out over there all the time and not spending any time with us. There are 2 ways that we are able to manage that particular concern. One is by having me track every minute that I spend, which I will be honest with you that if I have to get to that point, I will. But I'll also be honest with you in saying that I don't, because I believe that it's my responsibility to make sure that the congregations know that I am present for them. The other thing that we have, because we have a shared ministry agreement, which, by the way, is on file in the Penn Southeast Conference office and is available to you because Bree's got copies of it. We have set up specific processes, specific ways, because we actually have a covenanted ministry team. It's a group of 4 folks from each congregation. They come together once a quarter, and their responsibility is to listen. If there's feedback from the consistories about how the relationship is going, if there's feedback from people in each congregation about how the relationship is going, and they are able to say, okay, Mary Jones said you're spending way too much time in Schuylkill Haven and not enough time in Cressona. Help us to understand this. and then we work it out. And then we work it out. Communication is incredibly important. There is the understanding, and I'm still working on struggles and growing edges. There is the understanding that, I may not be able to go to every committee meeting. And personally, thank you. I may not be able to go to every congregational meeting. It's an adjustment. It's an issue. And I may not be there for some of the administrative pieces, but it's an adjustment. And I'll be, honest with you. There are some some committees that function way better when I'm not there. Folks know what has to happen, and they don't necessarily need the pastor to be there for every single decision that takes place. Some other struggles is some congregations may find, and I've heard this. It's not been my experience, but there is some triangulation in the communication process where one congregation thinks that the other congregation isn't doing this right, or one congregation's doing this and the other congregation thinks they have to do that. And it is a process of having two congregations that communicate with each other. Ultimately, what it's broken down to for me, and what I have shared with my congregations, and I've been very open with this, is that it is a choice. It is a choice about being served by your pastor and hoping that the pastor figures out how to make you happy. Or it's about being partners in ministry and sharing together the life-changing gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And it is getting down to, what are we supposed to be doing as congregations that we can do better, because we're not so bound by having to pay the pastor by ourselves that we're actually able to do ministry better together. Questions on that piece?
So I'm going to add something just really quickly that I wanted to point out. One of the things that, I gave you the statistics on a full-time position only receiving so many profiles, compared to 5 years and all those sorts of situations. The reality is right now, it's already difficult. It's really hard sometimes right now, even for churches that can provide a full package, meet compensation guidelines, all those sorts of things. And not all our churches can. I understand that. And I always tell search committees that, do what you can do, but be realistic about what you're asking a minister to do for a certain amount of money. But the other side of that is that it's much easier for pastors to be able to, it's much easier to get profiles for a situation where two churches have come together and said, we have a 2-point charge. We've decided we're going to search for a pastor together. So that what we have with a particular example is Linfield and First Royersford in our setting. One of the things they've decided to do is to share a search together. Both of them are contributing basically $50,000 a piece to a package. We'll put that together. That is a strong package against two different churches. Both of them are smaller. And they do reserve the right to be able to, in the end, if they want to find somebody who's part-time or they end up being the candidate. But one of the things that's interesting is the profiles that have come to those two churches would not have come there, I suspect, if it had not been really clear that if you serve both churches, we're working together and there's a search process we're working together on, that this is a full-time position. Because finding pastors for part-time positions is very difficult. Full-time are struggling, part-time are struggling even more. So that's another way of kind of thinking about it as well. I'm sorry, other questions you guys have?
Can I ask a question for what you just said? This is Bonnie Yost from UCC East Goshen. How do you go about, like, we have an interim pastor right now, so we are in this process. How would we go about finding a church to put out that profile for both of us, be it a Lutheran church or another UCC church, or, so how do we go, since we yes, we have an interim pastor, but, how do we approach that? What's the approach?
So the approach, I'm going to talk about that at the very end of this. So I'm going to give you sort of some ways of approaching it. So Bonnie, I promise I'm going to ask your question at the tail end of this gathering, if you're going to be okay with that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right. Thank you.
This is Linda. I had a comment, and I just wanted to thank Pastor Kevin for sharing so openly his experience. It came across to me as very positive, and he said it is important to be very, very positive, to consider it an opportunity to do this, to do the Lord's work in a better, broader fashion. Could you finish the? I didn't record the last word that you had. You said consider it an opportunity to share and not a blank. What was that word you used?
What I had lifted up is that congregations have to make a fundamental choice between trying to make sure that everybody is happy or living and sharing the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ in the congregation and in the community. I think is what I said.
It was a nice quote, but I'll come. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Any other questions? We're going to get into some experiences from other pastors as well. Any other kind of question for Pastor Kevin? He'll continue to speak in a few seconds around sort of the experience of how it came about that he ended up serving two different congregations. Any other questions before we go and allow him to speak more? All right. So, Kevin, one of the things that, one of the questions that just came up that Bonnie brought up was, how do these things come about? How does it happen that churches end up saying, hey, let's do this together. Let's share a pastor. And all three of these churches, the leaders of these three churches or series of churches are going to share about how it happened in their setting and what's going on with Steve Byron, as well as Lauren Kane. And Kevin is going to start us off because his church is unique in the sense that it has a formal shared ministry agreement that you just heard about. But Kevin, why don't you share that story with us?
Okay, and try to do it in 10 minutes. Yeah, we'll see how that works out. Okay, gotcha. As I had lifted up previously, I started out as the pastor. It was a full-time call to St. Mark's United Church of Christ, but St. Mark's will be the first to acknowledge that it was a full-time call, but it was not at Penn Southeast Conference guidelines. And so there was some concern from them about, well, you're not going to stick around, you're not going to stay because it's a full-time call, but it doesn't really support what the conference is asking. And so had been there for 2 years, and you know how congregations talk, especially ones that are close to each other. And the position at St. John's became available. And I have some forward-thinking lay leaders at St. Mark's who simply said, well, can St. Mark's have any possibility of having a role in helping this congregation, in helping our sister congregation? 1.5 miles away. Half of them were related to each other. Some knew each other, some got mad at one congregation and went to the other, and vice versa. And so it simply started out as a dream, as a what if. And then I consulted. At that time, it was still Dr. Manasian was in Kevin's role. And I made sure that I was extremely open with my congregation, extremely open with the conference, extremely open with the Committee on Ministry of the Schuylkill Association. I didn't want to come across like I was trying to play some game. And then met with St. John's leadership team. And the process evolved from there. And it was a process that took a bit of time. And we continued communicating with the conference, continued communicating with the Committee on Ministry. St. John's did not bring an interim in this particular situation. And I shifted my call to being a call from simply at St. Mark's to a call extended by St. Mark's and St. John's into a shared ministry arrangement. The other thing that was extraordinarily helpful, particularly for core leadership from both congregations, was that we had a 90-day trial period, which very quickly extended into a 180-day trial period, because folks just wanted to say, you know, can we just possibly see how this is going to work before we commit to anything? After the 180 days, it was, okay, well, when can we get this squared away? It was a process of getting the paperwork squared away. As Kevin lifted up, we have a shared ministry covenant. It is a document, and it has been extraordinarily helpful. And I'm not going to sit here and read it to you, but there are a couple of pieces of it so that you can understand how important this particular document is in the relationship for the two congregations. The way that it starts and the way that I try to guide my ministry is it says a shared ministry covenant between St. Mark's UCC, Cressona, PA, St. John's UCC, Schuylkill Haven, allows the two congregations to share a full-time pastor. The pastor will minister to both congregations without compromising the integrity of either. The pastor will serve both congregations without exhibiting preference to one over the other. Both congregations, while sharing a pastor, will maintain their own consistories, finances, identity, and autonomy. The covenant then explains the role of the shared ministry council in high detail, even going into terms of office and who meets where and all that lovely stuff. It also talks about, you know, the specifics of the financial arrangement. It also talks about how this is a covenant. And if I would get hit by the bus, or if either congregation would feel that this covenant was no longer serving no longer what they wish to be, there is within the document a way to dissolve the covenanted arrangement. And so it both provides congregations guidelines for how to be in relationship together, and it also offers that if it does not work, there's a very clear strategy to be able to move forward from the document. And just so you know, this shared ministry started out as, you know, coming together and sharing a pastor. But I will tell you now that we are doing cantatas, picnics, Lenten services, youth programming. Teams and committees are resourcing each other. I have 2 administrative secretaries that are now in cahoots, which is extraordinarily dangerous for me. And I've got 2 congregations that are enjoying each other and that are waiting to see what's going to happen next. It's been amazingly energizing. Was that 10 minutes, Kevin?
That was perfect, brother. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pastor Kevin. So I want to introduce the next speaker real quickly. I'm going to remove your pin real quick, and then I'm going to highlight the Reverend Stephen Myron, who is going to share with us his experience as a pastor and what he's experienced in terms of how he ended up serving 2 different congregations, which is a different story than Pastor Kevin. And so, Steve, thank you for being here. Can you share your story with us and share the stories of those 2 congregations as well?
Yeah, I serve St. John's United Church of Christ in Richland Town and Pennsburg United Church of Christ in Pennsburg. Very, very different congregations than what Kevin was sharing. Very, very different situations, and very non-traditional path that I led to being there. St. John's, just a little bit of background. St. John's was a declining congregation before COVID. They were in an interim situation for 2 years before COVID that continued through COVID. They were in dialogue while COVID was happening with the Lutheran Church in Richland Town for a shared ministry. And they believed that that was a path that they were going to be taking. And at the last minute, the Lutheran Church pulled out of that. And their interim had said that she was retiring at the end of the year. This all happened in October. So the conference office sent a letter to area churches near Richland Town, just asking if there would be any church that would have an interest in sharing their pastor with Richland Town. The church that I had been serving was moving from full-time to half-time. So we contacted the conference, and the conference put myself in contact with Richland Town. I had one meeting with Richland Town's council. After that meeting, they contacted me and offered me the position as a called pastor. We had a second meeting to talk about contract and to decide on the contract. I preached a trial sermon and was called by the congregation. All of that happened within 5 weeks. There was no profiles, there was nothing. It was simply the congregation before I came, when things fell apart with the Lutheran Church, they were talking, what do we do with our resources if we close? They were averaging maybe 20 people in church on a Sunday. So it was just they were in a very difficult position. I started a year and a half ago. And a month after I started there, my relationship with my previous church ended. Now, I was in the very fortunate position. I don't have to work full time. So I spent the next year just serving a half time at that congregation, enjoying it very much. They now average about 40 people in worship. So things have picked up for them. I don't think Kevin would mind if I shared this story. He and I were having lunch together, and I just happened to mention, this was back last fall, and I just happened to mention that I live in Pittsburgh, and his eyes lit up, and he asked me, well, would you have any interest in serving the Pittsburgh church half time? They're open, and looking for a pastor. And I said, okay, we want to talk to him. Now, their situation had been, they were in a half-time position with another church, and that had been going on for a year. And at the end of that year, the pastor told them that he was going to go and just serve the other church that had been in that covenant, and he would no longer be their pastor. There was a great deal of anger and feeling of betrayal within the Pittsburgh congregation. They too had been a declining congregation, and their decline was really put on steroids by COVID. So I met with them one time with their consistory. They contacted me after that and asked if I would be willing to serve as their designated pastor. So I am a half-time designated pastor with a 2-year contract. To just tell you where they were at as a designated pastor, I'm supposed to indicate what my ministry primary purpose is. I am a designated pastor for stability, because they felt more than anything else they needed stability at that point. They were a little under 20 people in worship. And so struggling a great deal. They too were dealing with questions as far as what to do with their assets if they closed. So I started there in January, and I want to step back, talking about relationships with St. John's. As I was serving St. John's halftime, we talked, and I just let them know, if another church needs a pastor in the area, and I'm approached or I become aware, is it okay if I talk to them? And they said yes. And the agreement that we had was, if something came up, I would be very transparent with them as far as what was happening. And I would not do anything that would be detrimental to my relationship with them. That I would talk with them about it, and would not move forward unless they were comfortable with with the situation. They consented, and so I'm now serving both congregations. Very different than what Kevin described, because neither of my congregations has that excitement of beginning to work with another congregation and envisioning what ministries together we can create. I have two separate contracts with both churches. I'm half-time at St. John's, I'm half-time at Pennsburg, and I am the only connection that those two congregations have together. I am working with two separate congregations as their pastor, but the congregations do not have any other kind of relationship. Now, like I said, what that means is they don't have that excitement. And with the past that they're dealing with, we're dealing with a lot of grief and loss and anger over where they find themselves. Very recently, both congregations were being served by full-time pastors. So there is that sense of failure that we've come back so far that now we only have a half-time pastor. A lot of looking back and saying, geez, we used to have a peach festival and we had hundreds of people who would come. And now we just don't have enough people to do the peach festival. Looking at and really having trouble envisioning a ministry with the size that the congregation is now. What I found is that before the congregations can move forward, as we've been talking, there needs to be a reconciliation and a celebration of the past. Because both congregations, not so much St. John's anymore, but both congregations were looking to the past and regretting what they could not do anymore. So St. John's just finished. We spent the spring celebrating the past, lifting up who they were. We had a pastor who had served the congregation through what I would consider to be their golden years back in the 90s. We asked him if we could bestow upon him the title of Pastor Emeritus, and celebrated his ministry as a part of what we were celebrating. And at the end of that, I preached a sermon on, as we ended our celebration, on pruning and the pruning that God does among us. And that this congregation had certainly been pruned over the last 10 years, but that the pruning is something that is done so something new can grow. And that is the transition that we are making. In the spring, in the fall, this coming fall, we are going to be discerning who we are as a congregation right now. Because they're still trying to grasp, who are we if we have 40, 50 people in worship on a Sunday? We're not who we used to be, but who are we now? So we're going to do that through the spring. And then next year will be a year of looking to the future and envisioning and planning for where God is going to be leading us now out of who we are. Pennsburg is not nearly to the position to be able to do these things yet. We're still trying to stabilize the congregation. But eventually, I believe that they will reach the point where they're prepared to begin to take those steps. A couple of things that I did want to mention. 2 different worship services. It's been touched upon. I would emphasize you're talking about 2 different worship services at 2 different congregations with 2 different traditions and 2 different ways of worshiping. I'm a firm believer that you don't change a worship service at least through the first year when you've been to when you're serving a congregation, which means the experiences are very different. It's been fun for me because I get to experience 2 different styles of worship at Pennsburg, a lot of times I don't robe because it's much less formal worship service. I always robe except this summer at St. John's, or at Pennsburg. St. John's is informal, simply because of who the congregation is and their style of worship. The other thing about worship is it is a very different experience. They both worship on Sunday mornings. I get a half hour to get from one congregation to the other. When I look at a congregation and after the benediction, I say, I'll see you next week. And I walk out. The fellowship is just very, very different. And I would agree with what's been said. Probably the biggest sticking point as you get started is worship times and how you're going to handle that. But to be creative, right now, we flip-flopped after 6 months. Right now, I'm worshiping at 9 o'clock at St. John's and then leaving right away. So this Sunday, what we're doing is we're fellowshipping before worship so that I can spend more time with the people. We have a breakfast once a month before worship, and we invite people, and that way we can fellowship together. Positives about it: each congregation is planning their own ministries, which is exciting. I'm excited eventually with Pennsburg, but especially with St. John's, the future that congregation has, and where I believe the possibilities that lie open to them. So you have that where each congregation, you're going to be a part of their planning a future together and discerning where God is leading them. The other thing that I would say, a couple of other things, I think it's important that you identify and maintain boundaries between the two congregations. And by that, I mean, I'm very honest with both congregations. I will share with you, if you'd like to know about some of the ministries and steal from the other congregation. I'm a big fan of stealing ministries and ideas. I'll share ministries with you, but I will not talk to you about what is happening internally within that congregation. That is private information for that congregation, and really a need to maintain those boundaries if people ask, well, how are things going over there? The other thing that I would want to say, and I'm looking at my time here, I think it's very, very important, if you are thinking about this as a pastor or if you're thinking about this as a congregation, you call a minister who has a very strong sense of self, who can differentiate from the congregation and step back. Because if you're going to call a minister who is going to become enmeshed within two congregations, there is going to be spillage all over the place of the minister bringing in, especially in a separated situation where the two congregations do not have a relationship. If the pastor can't differentiate, issues from one congregation through the pastor will be spilling over into the life of the other congregation. And it is just going to be, I could see it just being a mess trying to separate all of that and dealing with what's happening. So I would think for myself, that might be the most important aspect of who you would call, would be somebody who can separate and hold the congregation separate and himself or herself separate. So I guess those are the things that I wanted to mention, if you'd have any questions at all.
Steve, those are wise words. I love the idea of that sense of self and knowing that, my relationship with one congregation is different from my relationship with another, and to try to keep those boundaries and make sure that my frustration, perhaps as a pastor, I may be dealing with something in one congregation, not affect my relationship with another congregation. I think those are really wise words. I wanted to now highlight.
Kevin,
Yes,
I have a question for Pastor Myron, if I can.
absolutely.
So I'm familiar with both of those churches. Now, I'm not spilling out anything confidential. I know where they are, I guess is what I want to say, and a little bit about each one. So I'm not trying to get at anything super secret, but it comes to something that I asked in a breakout group with Pastor Fructal, which was even today with Zoom and, online and everybody doing everything everywhere. Since I do know the geography a little bit, I'm wondering if the reason that they don't work together more closely is because they are 25 minutes away. Those are like two different communities between Pennsburg and Richland Town. So it's a little different if you're 5 to 10 minutes and everybody lives within a certain whatever radius. And, I know there's always outlying things, but I guess the way I would frame those two, that's what's making me ask this. Like Richland Town, that's a whole other bag of stuff than Pennsburg. And I'm wondering if that prohibits them or limits them maybe a little bit more in trying to collaborate.
I would say that I've asked both of them if they would like to do things together and start to plan things together. I would say for both of them, because their previous experiences, they both got burned trying to work with other churches. And I mean, both of them had churches step away from them as they were trying to do things together. That they're very, very hesitant to try to do that. So we're taking baby steps. We have Rally Day as Sunday school begins for both churches on September 10th. We're going to do that together. We're going to meet at a park. We're going to have worship service in the park. We're going to have lunch together. We're putting together crafts and games for the kids. And it's the first thing that they're going to do together. And I told them, I feel like my two families are coming together and they can start to swap stories. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that, but I said, you can share stories together. So they are going to start to take baby steps, but they're really going to have to be baby steps at this point. And yeah, I mean, the shared ministries being about 20, 25 minutes apart, that is different. If we would ever want to do youth programs together, we would be dealing with 4 different school systems between the two churches, which is a little bit more complicated than if all the kids are going to the same, even 2 school districts. So I have no idea if they will ever share more than that. Right now, I'm just looking at the specific events that we can hold together and activities that we can hold together. And because, if mission today is in our local communities, well, they're ministering to 2 separate communities. So that also will influences how much they can do together.
That's kind of what I was alluding to, but I hear you about the history, the specific history about collaboration and being burned and all that might be even more the factor there than the geography, but that's what I was curious about. Thank you.
Well, and I look forward, I'll just one more thing. I look at it, one of the situations that has occurred with both congregations is that in Pennsburg and in Richland Town, you have folks who have moved in, and basically it's a suburban life. They've moved into these communities, they work elsewhere, and they moved into what were basically the small towns of Pennsburg and Richland Town. And you have 2 communities here. You have the suburban folks and you have the old community. And both of these congregations are a part of the old community. And they've really lost touch with the community as a whole in which they're ministering. And I feel for both of these congregations, their future lies in reconnecting with their communities and beginning to minister to these communities. And they can't do that together because they're in separate communities. So that will really limit to how much they can do.
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that struck me is that hurt over a failed partnership with another congregation can sometimes get in the way of thinking out of the box. And so it's so important. I mean, just to remind people that the first time someone breaks your heart, it should not be the last time you seek to go out and find somebody who will be a companion with you, in terms of the rest of your life. So every time we sort of, choose to be in some sort of relationship with another human being, it's a gamble. We gamble with hearts, we gamble with communities, we gamble with the fact that God may yet find something new in this partnership together. So, but I also love the fact that it's important to be realistic and to say and to name those times when it didn't go well. Because there are a lot of good things and a lot of bad things about it, and sometimes some church hurt around that as well. So I thank you so much, Steve. Those are a lot of wise words and a different model, as you heard before. This is two churches that don't have much of a relationship with each other, and they may yet have one, but it's very different from Pastor Kevin's experience. The third model I want to point out is to actually share with you the Reverend Lauren Kane. I'm going to pin her to our talk here. Hold on, let me remove the pen here and then find her somewhere in here somewhere.
Here I am.
There we go. There we go. That's much easier if you wave your head. I'm going to pin her to the conversation, and she's going to share with you her story of how she ended up serving both the UCC church as well as an ELCA church, I think here in Pottstown. I passed by one of her both of her churches roughly most of the days because I live here in Pottstown. So Pastor Lauren, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. And first off, thanks to you all for being a part of this this workshop and being willing to kind of explore the possibilities around ministry. As Kevin said, I serve two congregations. The first is St. Paul's UCC in Pottstown, as well as Grace Lutheran Church, also in Pottstown. And they are approximately 4 blocks apart, right around the corner. So down the street, around the corner from the Turkey Hill is where you'll find these congregations. So just to give you a little background of myself and how I got to this point in my ministry, I was ordained in 2019. So I'm on the younger side of Kevin's statistics that he offered earlier. And I've served in a variety of settings. I first served as a hospital chaplain, then moved into a retirement community as their faith coordinator and chaplain. During that time period, I also began serving a UCC congregation as their stated supply. So I was full-time at a retirement community and then stated supply on Sundays at a UCC congregation. Then COVID hit, and I lost my my job as the chaplain of the retirement community. And so I was just as stated supply, and also a new mom. So I couldn't really support my family on stated supply, salary, and unemployment. So it was at that point that I then began as the settled pastor of that UCC church. They essentially converted my status, voted, and affirmed me as settled pastor. And I also began in October of 2020 at St. Paul's UCC. So this would be the second UCC church. I served both UCC churches throughout the pandemic and left the first UCC church last fall. And that was when I began at the Lutheran Church. I've been at the Lutheran Church since 2020, October 2022, sorry. It's a lot of numbers. So I've been at St. Paul's since October 2020 and the Lutheran Church since 2022. Like I mentioned, both churches are just blocks apart. So kind of going to the conversation and the points that Steve brought up, these are congregations that are in the same neighborhood. Folks that live blocks apart from each other, down the street from each other, have in a lot of cases grown up with each other. The congregations in some ways are similar in the sense that they both have been experiencing decline. They both also have a long history of not having a pastor in place. They've gone through supply after supply, then interim, then designated, then back to supply, and in some cases for quite a while. And so they both have kind of that experience of instability and not having a settled pastor in place. So when I came into both congregations, both at different times, right, they had that experience of me being their first settled pastor in quite some time. And that also being kind of a milestone for them, that they finally have a settled pastor in place, and now the future can take place again. They also, their similarities also are around the fact that they have few, if any, children in the congregation. And in fact, on most Sundays in both congregations, my kiddo, my 3.5-year-old, is the only child in church. So they both have that kind of situation that they're thinking about, that they're trying to tackle. So what are the complications of serving two churches? I want to give you the bad news before I give you the good news. Okay, there are two systems. No matter what, whether it's UCC and UCC or UCC and another denomination, there are two systems that you are having to navigate as a pastor. There are also two sets of challenges. Each congregation is going to have its own problems that come up and will need its own energy to navigate. There are many personalities. So you have a church, you have one congregation with a lot of personalities, multiply that by 2 with 2 congregations. And, you know, they say that every church has its thorn. Well, now you have 2 thorns with 2 churches. Mm-hmm. Guarantee you will find someone in each congregation to be your thorn. There's also lots of names to remember. One congregation, there's a lot of names there to remember. If you have a large membership, even if it's not a lot of folks in attendance, we all tend to have bigger roles. So 2 congregations means even more names to remember. As Kevin was saying before, just trying to keep everybody straight. Which congregation are you a part of? And also remembering that when you call someone. The other day I said, "Hi, this is Pastor Lauren calling from St. Paul's." I was calling a member from Grace. So just having to remember that. So there's just a lot of things just to kind of keep in mind for the pastor. Maybe, you know, if you're a person from the congregation, offer them a little grace because they're going to get tired. Now, one example I wanted to share with you in terms of kind of the positive and negative about 2 congregations. One congregation right now is navigating, treading through the unfortunate reality of having to get a new HVAC system to the tune of 80 grand, right? And so now as the pastor, I have to navigate a capital campaign, shore up those funds, go through the whole contracting process and the project. Well, the other church now also needs a new boiler to the tune of around $90,000. So now that's another capital campaign, another project to navigate, more funds to secure, 2 churches, 1 pastor. On the flip side of that, having to already started 1 capital campaign, I know what not to do for the second church and what to do for them. We have the opportunity to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. I will share that, you know, I mentioned before, every church, you know, a church is a rose with a thorn, more often than not. Those kind of challenging personalities may take advantage of the situation of shared ministry with 2 congregations to kind of stir the pot, I've already experienced that, and I want to give you a heads up that that is a real possibility. That those kind of challenging personalities may take advantage of that kind of past history that all of our presenters today have alluded to. And so being aware of that and keeping that in your frame of mind and setting good boundaries around that is really important. And also understanding that these are two congregations. The pastor may be working full time, but these are two congregations. And so what works for one congregation might not work for the other congregation. The example that I'll offer you is very recently. As I said, both congregations that I currently serve have hardly any children, and yet they both desire to have young families in worship. But there is nothing in place for children should they come. And so I challenge both congregations, let's get a Sunday school program up and running. Let's have something in place so that we can, let's plan that children will come. So let's have something in place for when they do come. So let's start a Sunday school program. I offered up my own child as the guinea pig for the program. One church bought in, the other church did not, because they're both in two separate places in their thinking, in their readiness to do ministry, and in what they feel ready and called to do. So one church right now is about to launch a Sunday school program. Come the fall, the church did a pilot program over the summer to kind of figure out the steps involved and how we wanted it to look. And then the other church did not do that. So keep that in mind. You might come into it thinking, well, here's an idea that both churches can grab onto. One might not grab onto that. Now, there are specific challenges in pastoring a non-UCC congregation, in this instance, ELCA. I know that we have a couple of ELCA folks joining in this workshop. So hi. So there are even more systems and more meetings to navigate. Whereas if you're serving two UCC congregations, there's only one annual meeting. But if you are serving a UCC congregation and a Lutheran congregation, you have an annual meeting and you have a synod that you had better be at. And there is also a totally different structure. Whereas in the UCC, we have conference ministers, associate conference ministers, committees on ministry, etc. The ELCA has a bishop and a bishop's office and staff that you need to communicate with and that you need to be aware of, and knowing kind of proper procedures in dealing with that. And also getting standing in that denomination. My journey to standing was completely backwards and not the way that it's typically done, but nobody cared, and so that's just how it went. But I do have standing in the Lutheran Church. The benefits of serving a non-UCC congregation is that I now, as a pastor, have a wider circle. I have Lutheran colleagues now that I've met, that I now know, that I now can call upon. And that also benefits the congregations because now they have a wider pool of clergy that they can now pull from for pulpit supply. My upcoming vacations in September and my continuing education in November for both congregations will actually be covered by a Lutheran pastor. And so this is a great opportunity for the UCC congregation. They get to experience someone from a different tradition than theirs, even though we're not all that different from each other. They'll now have kind of that exposure. It also empowers the laity, I think. because being a pastor of 2 congregations, I often make the joke that I have yet to clone myself, and so I cannot possibly be in 2 places at once. It's a joke, but I say it frequently because I think that it helps to kind of establish and remind folks of those boundaries, and that I am a human being and not able to multiply myself just yet. So in doing that, like that empowers the laity. The laity have more power, more responsibility, more expectations upon themselves to maybe step in the gap where and to take something one of the minor things off of the pastor's plate. So what this has allowed me to do in both congregations is to empower something that St. Paul's calls the congregational care team, and whereas the Grace Lutheran Church calls the home visitation team. These are lay folks that go and make those visits to folks that are homebound and are in the hospital. And we also have folks that aren't able to make visits, but they write personal greeting cards, and they send that to folks. And that's one way that they remain connected. And it really has enhanced the relationship between the members of the congregation in each congregation, instead of expecting the pastor to always do all of that. I do make visits to everyone that are on the homebound list and on the sick list, but those are less frequent. They're more quarterly instead of every month, and so that frees me up and also kind of empowers the laity to embrace their own ministry and their own skills. One of the other ways that I have navigated this is, like I said, setting boundaries and being really clear in communication. I have set office hours. Wednesdays, I'm at one church for a set period of time. Thursdays, I'm at the other church for a set period of time. And I do my best to, when I'm at St. Paul's, I'm doing St. Paul's work. When I'm at Grace, I'm doing Grace work and not mixing the two. I'm not at Grace working on the bulletin for St. Paul's and vice versa. I'm trying to keep in that frame of mind of that congregation that I'm serving. And by communicating those office hours, those folks know where they can find me and when, should they need to find me at any particular point. But I also communicate my email, my phone number, very accessible. The one thing that I protect very well is my Sabbath. When we had the breakout rooms, it was asked, kind of just about the energy and what's needed to really do all of this work. It is a lot of work, and I would encourage our laity, the lay folks that are part of this workshop, to really encourage your pastors who might do something like this, to protect their energy, to protect their vacation time. Encourage them to take their vacation time. Encourage them to do their continuing ed. Encourage them to keep a Sabbath. That my Sabbath is not flexible. It is Mondays. I'm not, you cannot find me on Mondays. The only person that can find me on a Monday is the office secretary, and she has permission to contact me if somebody dies, or if somebody is dying, or if there has been some kind of tragic event. Other than that, I'll deal with it on Tuesday. I protect that time with my family. It's one day during the week that my kiddo is not in school, so it's family time. And I would really encourage that both clergy and the congregation protect those times, because as Steve mentioned, you want a healthy pastor undertaking this work. It is a lot. It is a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. Like I said, there's more meetings, more worship. The other boundary that I put is one sermon. I'm not writing 2 sermons. One sermon for 2 congregations. When I prepare that sermon, I have both congregations in my mind when I prepare it. What I might do is within the sermon, I might bracket something that doesn't apply to that particular congregation. And then the next congregation doesn't hear that segment of the sermon, they'll get something different. But it all flows and it all works. But again, that comes down to time, boundaries, and energy. Some other challenges that come, I think Steve also pointed to this, is the availability. I'm at St. Paul's from 9 o'clock. Worship begins at 9 o'clock. Worship ends at 10 o'clock. I then have about 5 minutes to get to Grace Lutheran Church 4 blocks away, because worship there starts at 10:15. Yeah, so I saw those reactions on, yeah, it's wham bam, let's go. And I will often send a message to the council president at Grace to let them know that I'm running a couple of minutes late. And what they do is they just start without me. The lady will lead the service until I get there. And then I just kind of step right in and pick it up, and we just continue. And it's worked. I will tell you, just my personality, I hate being late. So I really hate that aspect of my job, is I'm perpetually late to worship at the Lutheran Church, and it's an ongoing conversation. But they did actually change their worship time. They were worshiping earlier at 9:30. So this is a shift for them, and we offer each other grace at Grace. So that's one thing. Now, serving a UCC congregation and a Lutheran congregation opens up opportunities for collaboration that might not be there ordinarily. So one thing that both churches have already done since the shared ministry came about over this past fall is we've had worship times together, particularly during Advent and during Lent. And so they have been able to see kind of what it's like for each church. For Ash Wednesday, we were at one church and did their traditional Ash Wednesday service and invited the other church into it. The thing that we did together during those services was the choir joined together. We had a joint choir, which was wonderful. And it actually created an opportunity long term. One member of the Lutheran Church is part of the choir there. During the summer, however, his work schedule changes drastically, and he's not able to attend worship at the Lutheran Church at 10:15. He's got to already be at work. So what he's done now during the summer is he comes to the UCC church and he sings in their choir, and he's able to be a part of worship and then go to work. And the folks in the UCC choir have welcomed him in. He's a part of them for the summer, and they've created some really great friendships. I've also noticed that, being that they are two different denominations in the same town, a lot of the folks that have grown up with each other, they know each other and they haven't seen each other in so long. And so when they come to these joint services, they recognize, oh, hey, we went to high school together. Oh, we were on the football team. Oh, how are you doing? How's the family? That kind of thing. So they lost touch, but they still know each other. The other thing that I want to bring up really is just the importance of really healthy, like I said, healthy boundaries, and recognizing that it is a lot of work for both the pastor and the congregation. The situation in which I am, there is no formal agreement. Each church is doing its own thing, and I'm their pastor. I'm the only thing that they really have in common, except when we do those shared events, those shared worship services. And then I've been very intentional about going slow with those things, because similar to Steve, both congregations have a pretty loaded history where it concerns shared ministry and just ministry in general being burned, and so they're very cautious. While Grace was looking for a pastor, they had done something similar in which they joined with another Lutheran church for their search and call. And they interviewed a couple of pastors, but neither church could agree on the pastor that they wanted. And that was because each congregation was looking for something different, and they weren't communicating that. So Kevin's going to talk about that in a little bit, but I just want to just put out there that if you do go down that road of two churches joining together for the purposes of a search, whether it's two different denominations or the same, be really clear and upfront about what your expectations are and what you're looking for, because otherwise people will get hurt when they realize that it's not going well. So just keep that in mind. But it's really, the possibilities with shared ministry are endless. As is evident in my case, I never thought in a million years that I would be serving a Lutheran church, but I am, and it's wonderful. It's really different for me. I get to do communion every week instead of once a month, so it's fun. But there is the kind of difference, a little bit difference in theology, right? For our Lutheran friends, we know that we have to finish all the elements. So I've got to be careful with not overpouring the chalice, right? Because I got to drive home. So there's things just to keep in mind. Everybody's a little different, but we're all serving the same God. We're all following Jesus. We're all the body of Christ here in Pennsylvania together. And it's a really wonderful thing. For all the downsides, there's so many more positives to it. And it's really it comes down to supporting each other. You have to communicate, and you have to support each other for it to work.
Thank you, Pastor Lauren. And I'm going to add in Pastor Steve and Pastor Kevin, because one of the things a couple of you did was to ask your consistories what their remarks were about what their experience of sharing a pastor was, whether it's more formal like Kevin or with Steve. If you could give us that in a very quickly so we can honor our 12 o'clock time, because I do want to share with some starting points for those of you who might be interested in that. Steve, you didn't have a chance to. Kevin, you did, though. You did talk to your folks.
I did. I just came off of, it's funny how this week has happened. We had our joint picnic this Sunday past. Tuesday night, we had a gathering where both consistories and the covenanted ministry team came together, did their consistory things, and then everybody up into the sanctuary. And in preparation for today, I asked my consistories, and this is all the quotes as best as I could get them from my leadership, saying, what would you tell another consistory that would be experiencing this and considering this process? And so these are quotes as best as I could get them. This has enhanced our ministry in the congregation and in the community. If you are willing to adapt in support of the bigger picture, good things can happen. Compromise when needed, but always remember your priorities. We all benefit by joining our resources together, finances and people. Communication is very important. This process has brought us positivity and hope. And my favorite, it's not as scary as it sounds. And finally, if you want, and then again, this is a quote, if you want to help save your congregation, this model might work for you. And that was what my leadership would like to pass along to y'all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Steve?
Yeah, my congregation, I'm not going to repeat what Kevin just said because their reactions were very similar. I talked to St. John's, and the one thing that St. John's, couple of things that they mentioned. Of course, I was their pastor first, and then I talked to them about being the pastor at Pennsburg. And their response was, well, this is a ministry that we can extend to them by sharing you. And I really had not thought of it in that terms, but they very much saw the sharing of a pastor as a ministry to the other congregation. Couple of other things, just more practical things that they passed on. The logistics, needing to consider the other churches' events when they are planning things that they very specifically want me to be able to be at. That's just, it's just another consideration you have to make. It's been mentioned before, finding a partner church, as it would be a concern that they would pass on. And then they just lifted up with me Sunday mornings, how you do Sunday mornings, and the concern for my time and my energy as their pastor.
Thank you, Pastor Steve. Thank you to
Amen.
our co-presenters this morning. I appreciate that. I want to kind of end this up with how would we begin to do this work, right? If you are in a place where you're thinking about this, or whether you have a full-time pastor who may be moving into a part-time position, or you currently have a part-time pastor who might be interested in serving another church, or you are actually in search. I gathered with a couple, about 6 churches in the Upper Bucks area at Solomon's UCC to talk with them about the idea of sharing a pastor and what that would mean. 4 of those churches are looking, 3 of them are already in search. The 4th one is probably going to move from a part-time or full-time to a part-time position. One of the things they did was to huddle together after the service to maybe begin some of those conversations. So that's one way to do it, which is, look around. Who do you know? The thing about Pennsylvania that I always kind of have to remind people, for those of you who grew up in this area, is that this is a unique area. I came into the United Church of Christ in Texas, where we had 73 churches across Texas and Louisiana. That's a lot of space in between UCC churches. The blessing of us in Pennsylvania, and maybe sometimes the curse, is that we're very close to each other. So there's a lot more opportunity to share a pastor than in a lot of settings across the United Church of Christ. Of course, our strength is very regional in this denomination. It's the upper Midwest, it's the Northeast. And so that's the reality. So in many ways, there's just a lot more opportunity to share here. So one of the ways that I would say is, number one, the probably most opportune time is when churches are finding themselves without pastoral leadership and have the desire to see if we could work together to find a pastor. Some of that can be direct communication between the churches. Some of it can be coming to me. And in fact, I would always say, please, whatever you when you start reaching out and thinking about these things, always communicate with me or Pastor Bill Worley, probably with me because I'm in search and call. So if you are interested in looking for a pastor, both within the United Church of Christ that you might be able to share with, or a congregation you might be able to share a pastor with, or a denomination, a pastor of another denomination or churches nearby you, please sort of at least have the conversation among yourself and then contact me. And the reason why I say contact me is, I am not a bishop. I don't have the control. I don't get to sort of push the pawns around the thing. But one of the things I can do for you, and one of the gifts of being part of connected to each other, is that we're also connected to wider church connections. That is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA that Lauren talked about. We have close relationships with them. Out of 151 churches, 20 of them share a dual relationship. We are also connected with the Presbyterian Church USA. I know my colleagues, what we call middle judicatory. I can pick up the phone and say, there's a church in so-and-so area that's looking to share a pastor. Is there a church in your area that's looking for the same thing, or has a pastor who would like to fill out the rest of their time to maybe be a full-time position, or could provide some of the things that Pastor Gary Rarick at Epler's has provided for that Lutheran church. We also have connections with a Reformed Church in America. We don't have a ton of those churches here. And we also have connections with the Disciples of Christ. Again, not a ton of those churches in this area. Our closest relationships is with the Lutherans. So number one is look around. Number two is contact me. Tell me what you're thinking. I can certainly come and talk to your consistory about what it would look like, some of the things that you've already heard here. We can, I've shared with you a map of UCC churches in your area that are part-time. Now, I will say that some of those churches that are part-time, and I should say not part-time, they're doing full-time ministry with part-time leadership, because just because you're part-time doesn't mean you have not a full ministry. But what happens is some of those churches are being served by pastors who have no desire to sort of be more than half-time in their own setting. So that's the reality too. They're not interested necessarily. But even if you are in that kind of setting at this point, the reality is the next time out, there'll be much harder to find someone who is able to serve you half time or a quarter time. So the more partnerships, the more ways of thinking out of the box in the near term, if you know your pastor's going to be retiring in the next couple of years or 5 years, to begin those conversations right now, that's really important. And again, I can pick up the phone on your behalf. The map I gave you is something you can click through and say, what's in our area? You can contact me, or whoever your leadership is, contact me. We can work together to see if I can make those connections for you. Because look, part of the reason why I'm doing this as someone in Search and Call is the reality is for especially smaller churches that can only do part-time in terms of their leadership financially, I don't have folks to be able to serve in many cases those settings. So I'm being kind of awfully selfish. I want to get you your pastors, right? I want to make sure that you have the pastoral leadership you think God needs for you right now. And so the reality is I'm going to be doing what I can to make sure that happens. I also, as I said earlier, please feel free to, you guys know your area pretty well. I don't know what Presbyterian church is around the corner, and you guys knew. It's amazing the amount of connections. That's the other thing I want to share with you. When I meet with churches, I'm always surprised about, oh yeah, my cousin goes to so-and-so church, and all these connections that are so ripe within the Pennsylvania area, that there are so many connections between churches that have a lot to do with family, and a lot of them are knowing what's going on in those places. And so there's nothing wrong with inquiring, but keep me in the loop. Let me be your resource person. If you're just beginning the process, that would be helpful, and I can help you with that. The other side of this too is that situation that Pastor Lauren talked about that I want to bring up with the two churches in Linfield and Royersford. Both of the model they took on, they decided to do was that they were going to say on the profile ministry opportunities page where all the positions are housed, they are listed as part-time, but on one section is full-time. Well, it's a full-time position if a pastor decides he or she would like to apply for both positions. And so what they did was they interviewed each candidate, the candidate who was interested in the full-time position, serving both congregations at the same time. They interviewed them separately. And then if there was agreement that we would like to go to the next step, that's when they would gather together and talk about, they would go forward and talk about, interviewing them together or doing a trial sermon or something like that, or trial service or something like that. To your point, Pastor Lauren, the other idea is the idea of actually clarifying. If we're going to do a search together, let's clarify what we need, what we think we're going to need in a pastor before we even begin to start interviewing them as well. So there's just lots of different models and different ways of doing it. We don't have a rule book in the sense of this is the way this has got to happen. All I would say is that everything needs to be done with integrity and following our code of ethics and all those sorts of things, right? So those are the options as well. So again, I would say look around, contact me, have some conversations amongst you. Call me in whenever you need me. I can be your agent for finding those connections. And again, I would say to you, if let's say you still have a half-time pastor who is not going to be retiring anytime soon, there's nothing wrong with calling me up or sharing this recording of sharing a pastor and saying, here's some things to think about when we know Pastor so-and-so is going to be retiring next 2 or 3 years. Here's another option for us that will probably generate more interest than if we try to put out a profile that is part-time. And that's the truth of the matter right now. I mean, again, with even really solid full-time positions that have all the bells and whistles, we're not getting the traction we did even 2 to 3 years ago. And so if the reality is clergy scarcity, the opposite of this, right? How are we going to do ministry in the future? Number one is that the laity is going to have to step up if the future has to be met. The reality is sometimes even pastoral leadership is found in your pews. The second thing is that we're going to have to be more creative about how we secure pastoral leadership for our settings. That's my sort of blanket talk about how that can begin. Are there questions as we end this time together? We got about 7 minutes. I want to honor our time. Let's see, I'm looking for raised hands.
Right here.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Linda.
Hi. What is the UCC church doing to get more pastors into seminary early? Like getting into the schools to have some coming down the pipeline, but then we've got church and state and all those issues. I don't know. Otherwise, everything is declining and we're going to go down to nothing. What's happening?
Well, I would never say, look, the church, however the church configures itself for the future, it's just going to be different than the way you and I grew up with, right? I mean, the idea, it's just going to be different, but the church is going to remain. It's the church is not, I would say the church is not in decline, but the way we're doing church is changing. Okay. I really do want to say that. I don't think of the eternal church will always be here. Now, how we do that church together has changed. The hard part about this is I don't think anybody has some solution to how do we reinterest those in their 20s and 30s that we have lost to the nun category. I don't know if anybody that's got that solution. Everybody's struggling with that. So one of the things that we had to own as a conference, and one of the things that both Pastor Bill Worley, the conference minister, and Pastor Sean James, is one of the things we have to do better, and all of you pastors need to do in your settings, is to look around and think about who God might actually be calling to some sort of pastoral ministry. Every church should probably have a sermon where one time a year, the actual calling forth of saying God might be calling you to pastoral ministry. And it may not be the 20-year-old, okay, or the 15-year-old. It may be the 45-year-old that in the back of their brains, they've been thinking that maybe God's been calling me, and you're the first person to say that aloud to them. That's sort of on us as pastors and as a conference to remember that we've got to ask, does it solve the problem? I don't think it's going to make up for what's happened, in terms of the numerical decline of the church, not the spiritual decline, because I'm not sure a church that is in the majority is necessarily the best kind of church to be. I think a church that is always remembering that there are other options, that there are not necessarily assumptions about the way the world works. We are, as a church, all of a sudden realizing there are people. Give you an example, just one example. And I got you, Kevin. I see you up there. One of the things that was interesting, I was in Chicago. They have a wonderful film school at Columbia College in downtown Chicago. Our church really was open to allowing a lot of these students to do their short student films. And it was so interesting as I was talking one of the groups, this young woman came in and she was checking out the area to see if they could film in the sanctuary. And she looked around and said, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Now, there's nothing particular. I mean, it was just a standard church. And she had gone to church all her life, but had never been in a building that looks like the church that you and I and Linda and all these folks grew up in. And she said all her life has been spent in worshiping in gyms, right? And renting out spaces. And it was such an eye-opening moment to realize that church, the way the church, having these buildings, beautiful buildings to the glory of God, that's probably not going to be the long-term future of how we're going to do things long-term. And there's a lot to grieve about that. So I don't know the solution, Linda. Nobody does. All I know is I know the gospel will go forward. How it's proclaimed might be different, but the proclamation will remain. And I have no doubt that God's going to do a new thing. And that's great because I know God's going to meet me in the future. Kevin.
Well, and Kevin, you might be able to speak to this better than I, but I do know that the United Church of Christ has brought in a multiple paths to ministry piece, where the standard of 4 years of undergrad and 3 years of seminary now is not the only path towards authorized ministry. And so there has been some acknowledgement that the old way of getting into the collar is not one that a lot of anybody is doing in that exact way anymore.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's exactly right. We have recognized that the model of a 7-year model of training up ministers is almost unaffordable. And it's hard to ask somebody to say, could you take on $75,000 worth of student loan debt to serve a church that might be lucky to pay you half time? And so there are different ways of giving training to folks who are going into ministry, including those without a college degree. So there are different ways as you talk with folks, and maybe it's God's call in your own life. So there's some folks that Stephen, go ahead and talk. Oh, Stephen, I think you're on mute. You're on mute, Stephen.
Here we go. Yeah, I was glad he brought that up because I have actually had some background with some more evangelical type churches. And, you know, some of them, boy, they'll get them right out of high school. They'll put them through a 3-year Bible institute, not even necessarily college. I mean, I'll give them credit. Most of those guys know scripture very well, but I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm not totally thrilled with that approach. But when when it comes to getting people out there in the field and some of the issues we're facing, you know, someone's put 7 years into school and now they're looking to get into a church. I mean, they kind of need an income because they probably have student loans, they've got families to take care of, but the churches that are looking are also maybe because congregations dwindling, they don't have the financial resources. That's a little bit of a situation where our church is in. We do have some cash put away where we're not in terrible situation, but for long-term sustainability, something is going to have to give.
Yeah.
And looking at those alternatives might be a way that those finances can kind of come into better focus.
So again, I want to reiterate what I said before. In the great getting up morning, what we will be held accountable for is for how faithful we were to the gospel that we were given, right? So whether we're big or small, doesn't matter. How we do ministry in the end doesn't matter as long as it's faithful. And so I would just invite you, if you have questions, feel free to send me an email. You're going to receive an email at the end of this with a lot of the links. I also put a link into the chat function that showed Pastor Kevin Fruchtel's workshop on sharing a pastor. He did an annual meeting. This will be in there as well as everything I've shared with you in terms of links. I want to thank you for holding forth for 3 hours with us. Thank you for your faithfulness. And if you have any questions or you're ready to have that conversation with me, feel free to contact me. Thank you for all that you are doing. Thank you for our co-presenters, Pastor Kevin, Pastor Lauren, Pastor Steve. Thank you for being here as well.
Thank you, Kevin.
Listen, have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I will see you guys later, okay?
All right.
It was awesome.
Bye-bye. Thank you.